Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about D&D IRL in real life. All right. So the reason why we're going to talk about this is the first thing I want to talk about two aspects of D&D IRL today. The first one is it safe to talk about Dungeons and Dragons IRL now? Okay. So let's talk about this. Why wouldn't it be safe to talk about D&D IRL? Why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't people talk about Dungeons and Dragons in real life? Well, for fifth edition, right? Is it a big deal? It doesn't seem like it. You're like, of course we can talk about Dungeons and Dragons in real life, aspects of Dungeons and Dragons in the game that might bleed over into somebody's real life, right? This doesn't seem like a threat in any way to talk about this in the current Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition culture. Are you remembering the 1980s? Whoa! 1980s Satanic Panic. There you go, baby. Let's talk, right? This is real, very, very real, right? 1980 Satanic Panic happens, and it's really kind of strange because in the 1980s there was this Satanic Panic. It's a big question about what actually happened. So one of the things that was happening was church-going folk were like, "There's a whole bunch of devil worshippers in America." Now the reality is, there were some devil worshippers in America, and they did some really bad things, right? But they weren't like half of your town in every town, right? So the reality is, is this like a 1% of the country problem? 1% of the people are worshiping the devil, doing terrible things, or is this not? There are some people who are like, oh, you could be a devil worshiper and never do anything bad. That's a whole different conversation. But the 1980s, the Satanic Panic was very real, and Dungeons and Dragons was quite involved, right? There were a lot of people like, does your game have a big devil on the cover? As we're discussing if the country is infested with devil worshippers, it was a big thing. It was a big thing, and back then people weren't like, "Oh, devil worshippers are just nice people, who garden." Right? They were like, devil worshippers do the stuff that the devil is known for, right? It's a big issue, right? So in the 1980s, this was very real. People were like, if my kid plays Dungeons and Dragons, are they going to be able to cast spells? And they'd be like, if my kid plays Dungeons and Dragons, are they going to go adventuring in caves? If my kid plays Dungeons and Dragons, are they going to learn to use a sword and shield? Or there were legit questions, right? And so it turned out that Satanism in the 80s happened to be much smaller than people thought it was, right? It was the problems that were connected to Satanism appear to have been connected to a few very intense, very bad groups, right? Group of people. There were, and here's the thing: when people talk about Satanic Panic, a lot of it was like, no, there's no Satanism in this town. But there were towns where there was some serious Satanism and some seriously bad things that are attached to it, right? Doesn't mean it was attached to Dungeons and Dragons, right? So Dungeons and Dragons was like, this game isn't about the occult. It's really not about Satan. It's really about adventure. And yes, we do have some occult concepts within our game, but guess what? We're going to adjust those for you, right? So it was a big, big discussion, right? So in the 80s, it was not safe to talk about D&D in IRL, in real life, right? But is it safe to do it today? And I'm going to show you my next slide here. I think the answer is yes, right? I think we've arrived in a new world where the reality is very few parents object to their kids playing Dungeons and Dragons. At this point, most parents are like, I am a lot more excited about the option of you reading 750 pages than I'm worried that you'll have some kind of untoward influence, right? And I'm specifically not concerned about untoward influence in your hardback books when you are connected to things that would peel the skin off your eyeballs on your phone, right? D&D is no longer a threat, right? It's just not, right? Not at scale. It's like flipped, right? Like maybe 1% of the parents in the country are still like giving people a hard time about D&D, but generally, I'm an evangelical Christian. I got more D&D books than I have sacred texts. No two ways about it, right? Things have changed, right? So, and I play with my kids, right? So, yeah, I play Dungeons and Dragons with my children. Yeah, so, yeah. All right, so let's talk about D&D IRL today. What does it mean, right? So it has a really different meaning. D&D IRL today is Are you reading Dungeons and Dragons and then taking Dungeons and Dragons into your real life? I'm definitely doing this. I absolutely right. The biggest thing I've brought into my life as part of Dungeons and Dragons is the three pillars of adventure. This is talked about specifically in D&D 5e: interaction, exploration, interaction, and combat. And I have fully embraced these in my life in the following way. And notice there's an asterisk on combat. I'll explain combat because that one seems a little weird, right? Exploration. So exploration, one of the biggest things that is a part of. You know what? We're going to hold off on exploration for 1 minute. Let me talk about interaction. So might sound strange, but a lot of people think I'm quite social, but I'm not actually super social. I'm very I have a lot of hobbies that are very insular. I'm in here by myself a lot, right? And social interaction doesn't come naturally to me. I do understand that I need to be socially interactive because it makes me a more healthy person here and here, right? And Dungeons and Dragons has when I read Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, they're like 1/3 of the game is interaction, 1/3 of the game is exploration, 1/3 of the game is combat, right? It just really blew me away. I was like, does that mean I should be mapping 1/3 of my life into social interactions? Because I wasn't there. Right? I was doing a lot of stuff on my own, right? Going to movies by myself, reading a lot of books by myself, not really talking to a whole lot of people, right? And this really encouraged me to be more socially interactive, to interact with people socially. It's a huge changer in my life, right? Personally, okay? Combat. Where does combat come in for D&D IRL? Well, it's figurative. I do not partake in any physical combat. But I was like, well, what can I combat, right? And I realized I can combat my own deficiencies, right? Are there areas of my life that I need to combat, right? So some of the things that I have determined to combat in my own life was procrastination, right? Ignorance, exclusivity, right? There are areas of exclusivity. I think most humans are not as inclusive as they could be, right? And so I've really done what I can to combat exclusivity in my own life. How am I exclusive about certain interactivities, about certain activities where I could be more inclusive, right? And so I've combat that exclusivity, right? And so basically, I'm trying to combat the monsters in my life, right? The things that are out of control. I'm going to defeat these monsters in my own life, right? And the other thing is, I think this is a big part because you're like, once you determine to do combat with your own negative aspects, with your own deficiencies, right? And even with your own bald, negative aspects. I think that's the best way to say it. You start to look inward and say, what am I doing that I shouldn't be doing? What are the things I should be doing that I'm not doing enough, right? And you combat that laziness, and you combat that desire to do the same things the way you're comfortable with, when maybe they're not good for everybody around you, right? This is a huge part of my life, and this came straight out of Dungeons and Dragons, right? 5th edition, right? And 5th edition really encouraged me to start to really look at D&D IRL, right? Let's talk about exploration. It's its own special subject. Here we go. This is the Blue Beast. This is my bicycle. I bought this bicycle about 6 years ago. It's an oversized frame. You can see I'm an oversized guy, right? And so as kind of like a dude who's a little bigger, exercise doesn't come natural for me, right? So Dungeons and Dragons really reshaped my life in this way. A friend of mine gave me an oversized bike a long time ago, about 7 or 8 years ago. And I didn't really do much exercise before that, but they're like, "We're moving away. We want to give you this oversized bike." And so I got on it, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a circus bear on a bicycle. And I was like, "I'm comfortable on this thing. I'm going to ride the heck out of it," and I did. And then I rode it for 2 years, and then it got stolen. Right, so the bike that got me on the road got stolen. Right, and I was riding around my area. Okay, but in 2014. When D&D came out, exploration came in, and that's when I hit the bicycle hard and went and used it as a way to explore. I've been over probably half the streets of Philadelphia, exploring Philadelphia on the Blue Beast, on my mount, right? This has been a huge part of my life, and it's not exercise to me. It's just exploration, and I go out and I'll do 5 to 15 miles in a day, right? Some days a little bit more, right? And I'm a weekend warrior. I do a lot of Saturday and Sunday stuff, and it's a huge, huge, huge part of my life. And it started when I was gifted something, but it really accelerated when I attached it to Dungeons and Dragons and understood that my bicycling was not just me out on a bicycle. This was my way to explore my real world, going back to those core three: exploration, interaction, and combat. Right? And so it's a huge, it's a really big thing. And D&D IRL is it's an element of my life. And I think we could start to talk about this: is how can we make D&D IRL positive, right? Because in the 80s it was very negative, right? But now we can really talk about it as positive. The last thing I want to talk about is, and this is an amazing piece of art by Wizards of the Coast, is adventure, right? Another part of my life is like I work hard, right? And through the week, you can lose days when you're working. You can just be totally into it, especially if you work in a job that doesn't allow you to really move a lot, right? But playing Dungeons and Dragons, as much as I'm like a healthy person has adventures, right? And I've built adventures for myself. I've built adventures for my wife. I've built adventures for my children. I've built adventures for my family. And looking at saying, hey, we're going on an adventure. And part of that is surprise. And so part of that is delight. And so part of that is a little bit of risk, right? But adventure is part of my IRL now, right? And I can't think of having a life without adventure now, right? It's part, right? We do things new, right? Part of adventure is not staying in the same place. Part of adventure is not doing the same things. It's taking risks and being prepared for those risks, right? And overcoming obstacles during your explorations, right? And adventure is a very real part of my life now, right? And I was about to say I don't have a dragon, but actually we now, the Garibays now have a leopard gecko, right? Like, named Jojo. So we even have our own dragon now. Like, life is an adventure, right? So D&D IRL is very real for me. And I hope that we can start to discuss this as a community, as a D&D community. Are there ways that D&D has impacted your IRL? I'm curious. I just told you ways it did for me. How about you? Where are you at? Has D&D impacted you IRL? I'd love to know your answer. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.